Welcome to the Unique History channel. Tonight we're going to be doing a reading called The Other Holocaust, The Terror, Famine in Ukraine by Peter J. Lorden. So let's jump in. People talk about the Holocaust as if there has been only one this century, and that the one unique in human history. But what of the one inflicted by Joseph Stalin Dagiashvili on Ukraine? Although Ukraine's Holocaust by famine resulted in many deaths of many more people than were ever attributed to Adolf Hitler in the official Holocaust, and although it happened only a few years earlier, few now living have any perception of it. That's understandable, as only one Holocaust is taught in our schools and constantly featured in the media. Could this be because those media are heavily influenced by people who have more to gain by promoting one while drawing a black curtain across the other? Is it merely by accident that obsession promotion of one would be diminished by the extensive disclosure of the horrors and dimensions of the other? Whatever the reasons for this disparity, surely it is time to right the balance. What historian Alfred Lithuanathal labeled 20 years ago as Holocaustomania still continues in a torrent of books, movies, and a manner of all media drum beating, leading some Israelis offended by this exploitation to quip, "There is no business like show business. No such exposure has occurred relative to Ukraine's Holocaust, although that tragedy is well documented." Harvard historian James E. Mace was being conservative when he wrote in Famine in Ukraine, 1932 to 1933, "The Ukrainian famine was a deliberate act of genocide." Marco Karanak, writing in the same book under the heading Blind Eye to Murder, wrote, "The victims of the famine in Ukraine were consigned to their slow and agonizing deaths." Where once again democratic governments maintain normal relationships and cooperate in suppressing news about a genocide. Yet the only official Holocaust has been globally recognized, Karanak adding that other has been met with some conspiracy of silence that is a little short of criminal. Wasyl Hershkov's The Ukrainian Holocaust of 1933 was published in 1983, and Miron Duluth's Execution by Hunger, The Hidden Holocaust in 1985. The latter stated, "History has not recorded another crime such as famine perpetrated against the entire nation, nor one ever carried out in such a cold-blooded manner." That Duluth was not exaggerating is made horribly clear in the definite work on this tragedy, Robert Conquest's The Harvest of Sorrow, published in 1986. Yet none of these well-documented accounts seem to have had much effect on public consciousness anywhere. How quickly the world forgets victims of even the most colossal evil-dealing, when those aware of it lack the means to gain public awareness. On an individual basis, perhaps the best remedy would be to ask anyone bringing up the Holocaust, which one are you referring to? Only a great novelist could make those murdered millions rise and walk before us and make us feel the shame and despair of people deliberately reduced to feeding on grass and tree bark, on diseased horses and dead humans, even the bodies of their own children. Vlasy Grossman's Forever Flowing goes some way toward that. Others can only recite the bare facts of what happened and who is responsible. The first thing to be grasped about the Ukrainian Holocaust, the single crime of our century, is that it arose within a system which was profoundly evil. Whoever doubts that needs only look at the Consul Stalin's Secret War by Nikolai Tolstoy, to whom any writer on this subject must be deeply indebted. For the sheer magnitude of its crimes against humanity, nothing in the history can match those of the Bolshevik regimes. V.I. Lenin, born Ulyanov, had declared at the outset, "The scientific concept of dictatorship means nothing more and less than unrestricted power, resting directly on the use of force. Yes, dictatorship of one party. For its absolute roots of rule to be absolute People must be made utterly dependent on the state. Thus, private property was to be abolished along with religion and nationalism. One loyalty was to be permitted, loyalty to the party, which later became loyalty to previously defied Stalin. All means of coercion towards this end were approved. All obligations regarded as treasonous, objections regarded as treasonous, and all decent motives dismissed as obsolete bourgeois morality. To these men, human life was nothing but a raw material to be hacked and hammered into whatever shape their ideology might dictate. Thus, Stalin wrote in 1928 that the purpose of his offense against farmers throughout the Soviet Empire was to remold the peasantry, its mentality and production along collectivist lines. People who had thought those lines would have anything to do with shared austerity or the cant about from each according to his capacity and each according to his need were sadly and often mistaken. Alexander Solzhenitsyn estimates in the Gulag Archipelago that some 60 million people died there from 1918 to 1953, at which time this horrific system still housed some 10 million in camps ranging across 1/6 of the earth. It was known by the secret police organization, first known as the Cheka, then the GPU, NKVD, MGB, and finally the KGB. Its founder, Felix Dzerzhinsky, said, "The Cheka is not a court. We stand for organized terror." Lenin had called for concentration camps as early as 1918, but their great expansion began in 1929. At that time, a Turkish Jew and former Black Sea luminary tycoon named Naftali A. Franco dazzled Stalin with a grandiose plan to build socialism with slave labor on a starvation diet. His guiding principle: we have to get everything out of the prisoners in the first 3 months. After that, we don't need him anymore. Franco's pitch gained him the title Chief Overseer of the Battle of Labor. Later, he was made a general in the NKVD. To populate a system where the death rate was so high, intentionally so because Stalin always feared an uprising, a constant supply of fresh victims had to be supplied. Thus, millions of loyal Soviet citizens were falsely accused and an entire national minority sent to join them. Accusations were especially facilitated in Andrei Vashkinsky's 1937 decree that it wasn't necessary to prove a person had said or done something wrong, but only that he or she might have done it. As MGB Colonel Vladimir Kornov told a victim, "You keep saying that you're only accused but not convicted. You must understand that this distinction does not exist for us. Everyone's guilty." Children were encouraged to denounce their parents, their friends, their teachers, nor were the children spared. They once made up a half of the Gulag population, it being customary for whole families to be shipped off and worked to death in the Koyoma gold fields or the coal mines of Volkhada. Even 12-year-olds were subjected to a full penalty. A Ukrainian boy in the terror famine getting 8 years for having 2 potatoes in his pocket. Why hadn't the Soviet people, including the Ukrainians, revolted against this hellish tyranny? The failure to do so certainly reinforced a negative image of them in the outside world. Yet how could the people rise against Stalin when most have never known anything but autocracy and the secret police were everywhere? Their character is shown in an order sent by NKVD boss Nikolai Yazov to one of his deputies. "You are charged with the task of eliminating 110,000 enemies of the people. Report results by signal. Such ruthless repression deprived the people of forming a resistance leadership. What could potential rebels do? People had to keep their heads down. In such a milieu, the safest advice was, which Lazar Kaganovich gave to his niece, never ask anyone about anything." The few centers of rebellion, notably some Ukrainian villages in the Great Famine, were wiped out. It must also be noted the lives of millions of people had undergone a huge dislocation, leaving them even more powerless to rebel. As we read in Red Empire by Hughes and Welfare, every industrial revolution requires a massive shift of the population from the country to the towns. 17 million people made that journey in the first 5 years of Stalin's 5-year plan. Illiterate, wretched, hungry, pushed around by a new ruling elite which despised them, these peasant hordes became the new working class of Russia. The terror famine of 1932-1933 was not the first. Ukraine had always struggled for its independence from its enormous and aggressive neighbor. That struggle became especially fierce after the Red Revolution, when Ukraine's declaration of statehood triggered a Bolshevik invasion, costing some 4 million lives. Not only was Ukraine the breadbasket of Europe, but a region of prosperous and pious farming communities. The southern Ukraine, in particular, exemplified those three things the Bolsheviks had sworn to abolish: private property, religion, and nationalism. After the massacre of Ukrainian leaders ordered by Lenin, who in 1918 offered his thugs a cash bounty for every landowner and priest they hanged, the 1921-22 famine caused by grain exportation killed millions more. Leon Trotsky was then heading the Red Army, with General R.P. Eidelman as his grain-grabbing deputy. Said Trotsky, "The rich granary is ours." The brutal means used to secure it, along with anti-nationalist campaign which saw Ukrainians shot dead on the street for merely speaking their own language, caused such a drop in the production the famine reappeared in other parts of the Red Empire. Fearing the general loss of control, the Bolsheviks had to invite foreign aid relief. Even when they insisted, through spokesman Maximovich Litvinov, the food relief only go to other parts of the empire, not Ukraine. In fact, Isidore Laren of Gosplan 5-year Plan Commission was still pushing for more seizures when transports were leaving points only 20 miles away from starving villages. Yet Litvinov told the world that the USSR was again exporting grain. The Soviet government was actually holding its own starving citizens as hostages to be ransomed for foreign aid. This duplicity was neatly illustrated by the spectacle of two ships breathed side by side in Mirnas, an American unloading grain for relief and a Soviet loading grain for sale in Hamburg, Germany. Lenin had to make a tactical retreat, temporarily banning Marxist dogma. His new economic plan encouraged Ukrainian culture while fostering the growth of allegedly independent Communist Party of Ukraine. Production duly improved, but by 1928, with Lenin dead and his own position secure, Stalin canceled the NEP. He launched a 5-year plan of industrialization to be financed by exports. A principal export was grain, since Bolshevik territory held that its production, along with political control of the peasantry, could be best increased by forced collectivization. The facade of Ukrainian independence collapsed. Collectivization meant that herding all agricultural workers into a kolkhoz, or collective farming complex, where the state would own everything and tell them what to do. Stalin's first and terribly consequential step toward it was to get rid of independent farmers. This category came to include even the smallest of smallholders, such those who had owned more than one cow or had hired others to work for them. These kulaks were denounced as vermin, capitalist roaders, and enemies of the people. Stalin's overall plan for liquidating the kulaks as a class throughout the Soviet Union was headed by Commissar of Agriculture A. Yakovlev. Its expediter in Ukraine was Yakov Bauman. In this dekulakization campaign of 1929 to 1932, some 3 to 4 million Ukrainians were either murdered or shipped away, often entire families to early deaths in the gulags. Only the poorest peasants then remained, and it was these who were left to starve in the villages from which the Bolsheviks have systematically removed every scrap of food. KGB defector Viktor Kravchenko wrote of them. They had been trapped and left to starve, each in his own home, by a political decision made in a far-off capital around conference and banquet tables. When told at the capital of their hideous suffering, Stalin replied, "Moscow has no tears." In July 1932, the Ukrainian Communist Party had seen a famine that was imminent and asked that the expropriations be reduced. Moscow's response, conveyed by Vlakishev and Molotov and Kaganovich, was that the quotas must be met. To ensure this, Stalin sent in the murderous Pavel Prochashev with his lieutenants Yeager and Mendel M. Katinievich, the senior member of the Politburo. Other accomplices included L.I. Kaminsky, chairman of the Collective Farm Center, and V.A. Batletsky, head of the Ukrainian GPU. He reported to Stalin's crony, General Vorshilov, in mid-1933, from 8 to 9 million people have already perished in Ukraine alone. Given that a few years later, Vorshilov would calmly countersign lists thousands of his brother offers to be executed in Stalin's purge of the military, this news was not likely to have upset him. But the prime movers and overall enforcers of the terror famine were Stalin's trustees. Molotov and Kaganovich were the two partners again in the terror of 1936 to 1938. Roy Medvedev in All Stalin's Men tells us that Molotov, along with Stalin's foreign minister and ever coldly efficient bureaucrat, played a particularly sinister role in Ukraine in 1932, where he directed grain production operations in the southern provinces. As for Kaganovich, he was always Stalin's chief troubleshooter. The man relied to get things done no matter what the cost in human suffering. When Soviet arms reconquered the Polish Ukraine in 1944, he was the man Stalin sent to speed up the collectivization. Kazan, however, stated, "Stalin felt that as a Jew, Lazar would be more ruthless in eliminating Ukrainian nationalist tendencies, and he was not disappointed." In addition to the millions dying in Ukraine itself, others died in nearby Don and Kuban areas. All told, some 8 million Ukrainians starved to death in the Holocaust of 1932 and 1933. Meanwhile, Stalin annually sold to the West expropriated grain equivalent into a quarter ton for each starved individual. No one should doubt that the terror was man-made and deliberate act of genocide. It stopped precisely at the Ukrainian-Russian border. Starving Ukrainians were forbidden to leave their homeland, and no one was allowed to bring food in to it. Tens of thousands of loyal urban communists, brainwashed to view the peasants as their enemies, were sent in the countryside to seek out whatever food the peasants might have hidden. One of them was Isaac Babel, another Lev Kabaf Red, known as the dissident writer. Red Empire quotes him, "Our great goal was the universal triumph of communism. For the sake of that goal, everything was to be permissible: to lie, to steal, to destroy hundreds of thousands and even millions of people." These expropriators were backed by 500,000 Red Army soldiers and countless GPU agents, not to mention the ubiquitous commissars assigned since 1928 to enforce collectivization. How these latter had behaved, depending on the peaceful villages, to bully the peasants into abandoning their independence, is best described by Miron Dolat, who lived through it as a boy. The arrogance of Commissar Zetlin is tellingly presented here. Peasants were told, "If you want to eat, join the kolkhoz." But in the end, there was nothing to eat even there. Watchtowers were set up in the fields, and anyone trying to glean a few grains from a harvest field could be shot for violating socialist property. That charge was even brought against men who tried to feed their children by catching fish in a nearby river. These people were supposed to die, and anything they did to avoid it was a criminal act. There was plenty of food could be seen in the piles of grains left to rot, but heavily guarded, maddening beyond reach. Whole transports were willingly destroyed in order to boost the export price. In all this, the harvest of sorrow previously cited. Overall figures on the death toll from Stalin's agricultural policy are hard to pin down, as Nikita Khrushchev subsequently admitted, without mentioning his own bloody record in Ukraine, nobody was keeping count. And Stalin did his best to ensure that nobody could. He had the 1937 census repressed and made it a crime for even to utter the Russian word for famine. The once prosperous Don Kuban areas, where some 5 million Ukrainians had lived, were reduced to the same utter desolation of their southern homeland. Particularly stomach-turning is the conquest chapter on the fate of children, who many had accounted for some 4 million death toll of Ukraine's total dead. Orphans of Kulak families were treated with special cruelty, ostracized or beaten up, denied little food given others. Few dared to help them because of the Leninist axiom in class struggle, philanthropy is evil. Many were shot or drowned in sunken barges. Thousands of others were left to starve under the guard in isolated camps or barns, or collected in a children's town which was actually a bare field. People asking their fate were told the party was looking after them. Indeed it was. Their corpses were hauled away by night. In the midst of this, conquest tells the story of Deputy Minister Commissar of Education M.S. Epstein, who spoke in glowing terms of Soviet childcare as compared to pitiful status of children in the capitalist countries. Were there no foreign aid organizations to help the people starving from collectivization, and not only in Ukraine? Indeed there were, but Stalin refused to let them in. Soviet President Mikhail Kalinin even branded such organizations as political imposters. When the foreign good distribution was finally permitted, Ukraine was again excluded. Stalin had learned from Lenin's famine how effective a weapon hunger could be. He was now using it to crush Ukrainian nationalism once and for all. No outsiders must interfere with his genocidal project. When it was over in late 1933, Stalin formed a committee for migration to settle the depopulated area with Russian farmers. Those sent in had to drag the corpses out of the houses and dispose of them. Although they were clean and whitewashed everywhere, the stench of death remained so pervasive that many gave up and returned to their own homes. As the distinguished editor of New York's Ukrainian Quarterly, Dr. Walter Dunchuk summed it up in a 1983 pamphlet that this was a gigantic Holocaust inflicted on a nation starving to escape Moscow's colonialism. What was the world's response to this horror? Some gruesome photos in the newspapers, a few demonstrations, but these were mostly swamped by Soviet propaganda. Officials in London and Washington knew the truth, but took the line that this was the eternal fate of the Soviet Union, to be ignored of the sake of preserving diplomatic relations with a friendly power. Part of a massive cover-up, that power was carefully sanitized by foreign dignitaries, such as the French Prime Minister Edouard Herriot, who denounced any talk of famine as Nazi propaganda. The cover-up also reinforced by communist sympathizers in both the British Foreign Office and American State Departments, and well as Fabian socialist George Bernard Shaw and James and Patrice Potter Webb. Tolstoy tells us that some affluent Americans also helped by pushing for an American recognition of the USSR for a lucrative deal on stolen Tsarist artworks. Banker Andrew Mellon and the Hammer clan, particularly Armin and his father, were prominent there. Armin's father having once led the U.S. Communist Party. A similar role was to be played in the years of 1937 to 1938 by Ambassador Joseph E. Davies, whose best-selling Mission to Moscow, says Tolstoy, was a sustained apology for all of Stalin's excesses. Stalin's chief spokesman in this famine was again Maxim Litvinov, now risen to foreign minister. He steadfastly dismissed all reports of famine in Ukraine as lies put out by counter-revolutionary provocateurs. To their eternal discredit, the bulk of Moscow foreign press corps backed him up. Only a few, most notably Manchester Guardian's Malcolm Muggeridge, tried to get the truth out. The rest, anxious to keep in with the Soviet censors, allowed themselves to be led by a man who Muggeridge had called the greatest liar I have met in 50 years of journalism. The man was Walter Durantini, an English correspondent for the New York Times. He ridiculed scare stories about the non-existent famine while privately telling friends that the death toll could reach 10 million. The other correspondents even joined him in lampooning an honest Welsh writer named Gareth Evans, who had backpacked through the famine area on his own and published a horrifying account of it in London. Duranty's reward came in a rare interview with Stalin, then his being allowed to accompany Litvinov on the Soviet foreign minister's American trip to the negotiation after FDR's December 1933 recognition of the Soviet Union. Then Duranty, in the very year of the Holocaust he'd helped to cover up, was honored by The Nation magazine for his enlightening and dispassionate journalism. He was eulogized in The New Yorker. Naturally, Karl Radek lauded Duranty in Pravda for his overcoming elements hostile to the American recognition. There can be no doubt whatsoever regarding the scope and the inconceivable brutality of the Ukraine forced famine. Yet one still hears it said by Soviet sympathizers that famine and all other Bolshevik crimes against humanity were actions taken out of historical necessity. Within such harsh message, they say, Stalin could have never industrialized and never have beaten Hitler. But how could beating Hitler have been helped by so opposing your own subjects to the extent that many of them initially welcomed the Germans as liberators? Yet, as the lies of Litna e alias still echo around the world, and they still constitute truth for the Soviet leadership as late as 1983, Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulroney's declaration to a Ukrainian group in Toronto that the terror famine of 1932-33 was a man-made tragedy manufactured in Moscow drew stiff protest from the Soviet embassy in Ottawa. And the cover-up continues. It is understandable that those massive and protracted horrors rate no mention in any Soviet encyclopedia. Interestingly, why does the chronology of John Paxton's California Encyclopedia of Russian History, 1933, show no entry for the epochal year of 1933? Such studies and exclusions emphasize why the Ukrainian Holocaust must be told. Solzhenitsyn complained none of the Bolshevik monsters such as Molotov and Kaganovich, then still living comfortably in Moscow, had ever been tried for their crimes against humanity, although some 86,000 Nazi war criminals had been convicted by 1966. He said the imagination and the spiritual strength of Shakespeare's evildoers stopped short at a dozen courses because they had no ideology. The story of the Ukrainian Holocaust must be continued to told, for the starved ghosts of those people murdered 6 decades ago are still with us, begging for recognition. Their most fitting epitaph may be a cruel comment of the commissar responsible for sending 50,000 of those loyal urban communists into the Ukrainian countryside with orders to be ruthless in stripping it of food. As recorded by Consul Mendel H. Katayanovich told, throw bourgeoisie humanitarianism out the window and act like Bolsheviks worthy of Comrade Stalin. Okay, thank you.